After a brutal Oregon storm, the hills beyond the Willamette Valley looked shaved raw, slopes peeled of their softer growth, the creek swollen and brown as coffee, and the sky still carrying the sharp metal smell that comes after lightning tears the air. Evan Mercer walked his lower pasture before daylight, headlamp cutting a thin white arc over ruined fence line and rutted tractor tracks, the shovel on his shoulder knocking gently against the strap of his bibs. He was 44, third generation on 230 acres that stitched together hazelnut rows, grass seed fields, a square of alfalfa he was proud of, and a patchwork of rough pasture where a modest herd of black baldies nosed through windfall twigs for anything green. He had slept maybe 2 hours in the long dark, eyes open to the rhythm of dripping eaves and the occasional thud of a loose sheet of tin against the barn roof. Storms came every year. This one had been different. The gusts weren't gusts so much as steady fists, and when the creek swelled, it leapt the banks and gnawed a new bite into the ditch that fed his headgate. He worried about the headgate more than he worried about the fence or the downed limbs. Water was time, and time meant whether this planting would pay the mortgage and the feed bill and the note on the used baler he'd finally allowed himself last June. He told himself he'd walk straight to the ditch, pull whatever mess had jammed it, and move on down the list. Check the south fence, call the neighbor if the old cottonwood had toppled across the line, get the generator off life support and back into storage. The list was a comfort. He'd learned that from his father, who said you can't fight the sky, only keep your hands moving under it. Past the calf shed, the track turned to soup, and he sank to the ankle with a sound like a boot sigh. He muttered, shifted his weight, and kept going, the headlamp finding its way along the line of fence posts that still stood like stubborn teeth. The creek talk was louder here, not the friendly gurgle of irrigation days, but a constant clatter, water shoving gravel over gravel. When he reached the ditch, he found what he'd half expected and half dreaded. A trunk laid diagonally over the water like a bridge, bark shredded and slick, roots torn clean of the bank as if a giant hand had lifted and set it there to spite him. A cottonwood, he thought first, then saw the stubborn thread of moss that ran its length and reconsidered. Maybe a maple, old enough to have swallowed a bucket's worth of nails from some long-gone pasture gate. He set the shovel down, leaned in, put his palm flat to the bark. The wood offered the dense, damp chill of something that had been alive yesterday and didn't know it was finished. He should have got the chainsaw. He had left it on the bed of the flatbed because he hadn't wanted to carry it if the headgate only needed a rake and a curse. He told himself he'd go back for it. Before he did, out of habit more than curiosity, he rapped the back of his knuckles against the trunk, one quick pop to judge if his saw would bind. The sound that came back wasn't the meaty thud he knew, as a farmer knows the voice of his dog. It was wrong. Not hollow like rot, not exactly. Hollow like an empty barrel with a throat. Evan held still. He knocked again, this time slower, and the echo answered tinny and spread out, as if the tree had become not a thing but a place. He switched off the headlamp and let dawn's grey have the shape of it. The storm had crushed the crown into the pasture grass, but the trunk itself had split where it crossed the ditch, a seam opened by water, wind, and weight. He could see darkness in the seam, and darkness inside a thing that should be pale heartwood was the kind of detail that had kept him alive as a man working thin margins on unkind land. He turned the lamp back on, went to one knee, and peeled with his fingers at a rag of bark where the seam puckered. The bark came away with a dry fracture. Beneath it, the wood wasn't wood. It was smooth, less scraped than polished, curving inward along a radius that suggested the inside of a pipe. He put his gloved fingertips to it and felt fine powder, not the spongy rot he'd pulled out of apple trunks 1,000 times, not punky. Dust. He rubbed thumb to finger. The dust was pale and dry as chalk. He knew hollow trees. He'd pulled raccoons out of them for neighbor kids who didn't know better. He'd cut around rot in a log when he could, and he'd watched mushrooms write their slow white script through the sapwood of a failing walnut. This was none of that. He chewed at the inside of his cheek and told himself a story, the only story that fit, that he was tired and early, and his eyes were making more of it than it was. He wedged the shovel handle in the seam and levered, careful of leverage and foot placement, because he was alone and had buried enough men in his head to know the difference between caution and fear. The bark gave with a shredded groan. A plate the size of a door hinge slid off. The seam widened. The ditch water slapped and hissed around the root ball, impatient. Evan leaned his headlamp in. The beam travelled along the interior. He had told himself to expect ragged, irregular walls. What he saw were curves, smooth, curved walls, the grain faint like the inside of a bowl. A patient hand had turned again and again. Farther in, the hollow widened, then narrowed, then widened again. Little bays like alcoves carved in the thickness of the trunk. There were marks along the walls, long, parallel grooves no beak or claw he knew would make, too steady, too consistent. He reached his hand into one of the alcoves and felt the line run under his glove as true as a ploughed furrow. He should have walked away. He had an irrigation ditch waiting on him, a gate that would starve his alfalfa if he kept treating mystery like a crop. He crouched lower instead and put his shoulder against the bark to break off a little more. When the panel fell, a slough of the fine dust poured out over his boots. In that powder, something ragged caught and held. He pinched it up gently. Rope. A length of rope so rotted the ends were fur, and the middle stiff, with the kind of older dirt that no rain had touched for years. He stared at the rope in his hand, until a thought that wasn't a thought said the word someone. And once the word was said, he could not unsay it. Someone had made this interior. Someone had used it. He swallowed, and set the rope on the grass above the ditch, and knelt again. In one of the back alcoves, where the split widened, he saw a circle of darkness that reflected dully when his light touched it. He steadied his breathing, eased his weight into a crouch that let him get one shoulder and one arm inside, without trusting the shattered edge to hold him. His fingertips mapped cold metal. He worked it forward. A can came first, dented and half-rusted. He shook it gently. Something dry shifted inside, thocked once and settled. He set it beside the rope. His forearm went back in, the jagged bark biting his sleeve. And he found another corner, not round this time. A small box slid free with resistance that felt like it had been wedged to be hard to pull. It was the size of 2 sandwiches stacked, all metal. A seam around it corroded shut, a little clasp that had once been bright cut into the rust like a memory of shine. He turned it over in his hands. It had weight a trinket wouldn't have. He wanted the chainsaw. He wanted to go backwards into the last hour and be a man with a simple problem, a log across a ditch. He blew out a slow breath and stood, put the box and the can side by side on the grass, wiped the powder from his gloves onto his bibs, and felt the little pebbles of grit under the fabric like the world's smallest bones. Evan had a way his mind did when it needed to choose. It lined up what was owed and what mattered, and looked for the overlap. He saw the faces of his kids before the overlap finished forming. Mason, 14, who pretended to hate the farm but slept easiest after a hot day stacking, and Wyatt, 9, who still asked if the cows felt the rain the same way people did. He saw how the creek cut by increments every storm, and how he patched by increments every spring, and how men who thought land was a thing to use left marks like this smooth tunnel where growth should have been. He took his phone from his pocket, saw the no-service bar sneer at him, and then remembered the ridge near the upper field where a single bar sometimes perched if the weather was right. He looked at the hollow again. The powder told him time had moved in there without weather for years. Whatever he decided now wouldn't be undone by 30 minutes up and back. He slid the box beneath a root shelf, tucked leaves and bark and a handful of damp grass over it, like a mother making a bed, did the same with the can, and set the length of rotten rope under the curve of the trunk where it would not catch a wandering eye. He took 3 pictures on his phone of the seam, of the marks, of his gloved hand for scale. Then he walked, not toward the house, not toward the saw, but up the pasture cut to the ridge where the wind he'd been fighting all night now tapped his hat brim like a nervous neighbor. They took pictures the way the storm had taken branches, everywhere. Measurements, the seam, the alcoves, the grooves. The ODFW officer lay on his side and leaned far in to photograph the deepest part, then backed out and dusted his hands, leaving pale prints on his knees. "I'm going to be straight with you," he said, standing. If someone is building hollows like this to cache gear, they're organized enough to have more than one. People don't do this for sport. It's time. It's quiet. It's purpose. And it tracks, with some of what we've been hearing about. Bear gall, elk ivory, birds. Animal parts move farther than people imagine, and the folks who move them use ground like this because ground is patient. Evan looked at the ditch water pushing impatiently at the root ball and thought patient wasn't the word he'd use for a creek that ate a little more of his field every winter. But he understood the rest. The deputy handed him a card. "I'll need a statement," she said, "and we'll probably want to sweep the edges of your place and the neighbor's property lines. You notice anything else, anything off, call me first, okay?" He said okay, because the alternative, to pretend he hadn't seen what he'd seen, was a muscle he didn't have anymore. Word went the way word goes in a valley where fields unroll like a tablecloth and lives fold around each other's hours. He hadn't told his neighbor, but by afternoon, his neighbor knew. By evening, the man who leased grass 2 farms over had texted him a photograph of a felled trunk up by his back fence with a caption that said, "Does your weird hollow look anything like this?" And the answer was yes and no, smaller, but the same trademark smoothness that had nothing to do with fungus or ants. ODFW came back with 2 more trucks and 3 more officers, and a man from the state lab who wore glasses on a tether and spoke to the wood as if it might answer. The deputy called in a second unit and asked Evans permission to set a pair of trail cameras along the creek, angled not at the animals that came to drink, but at the human paths that cut in and out of the timber like cursive. They walked the line between his place and the Rudolph place, found another fallen log, this one entirely on his side, that had been hollowed less artfully, a rougher sister to the first. Inside, a salt block shaved to a corner, and a length of wire twisted into something that wanted to be a snare. He felt anger, cold in the belly, and slow, a different element than fear. He had taught his boys that deer were neighbors, and elk were visitors, and even the coyotes had a job, that you didn't have to like the coyotes to admit that jobs matter. The single bar blinked into being, as if it were a bird that had to be coaxed to land. He didn't dial his neighbor. He didn't dial his cousin who ran the feed store and had an opinion before he had a question. He dialed the sheriff's non-emergency number because he had no idea what this was, and because he could hear his father's voice ask him if he wanted to be the man on the wrong side of his own story. The dispatcher listened longer than he expected a person to listen to someone explaining a tree. When he said the words hollowed out like a tunnel and rope and box, her tone changed. She asked if he was safe, and he thought that was funny until he realized he hadn't looked behind him for the last 5 minutes. She asked if he'd moved anything. He told the truth. She asked if he could wait by the road at the bottom of his drive, and he said yes, because waiting was a skill he'd been trained in by calfings and irrigations and weather that did not care about men. They came in 2 vehicles, the green and gold of the county sheriff and a white pickup with the decal for the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. The sheriff's deputy was a woman about his age with crow's feet that said she smiled when she wasn't working. The ODFW officer was younger, clean boots, steady eyes. They shook his hand, looked over the ruin of his lower pasture without comment, and let him lead. He felt strange as a tour guide to his own place. At the ditch, he pointed, then stepped aside, like a man in church making room at the pew. The deputy went first, crouching to shine her light into the seam. The ODFW officer ran his fingertips along the smooth interior, stopped at the grooves, and made a small sound low in his throat that did not sound surprised so much as tired. "Seen this before?" Evan asked without keeping the hope out of his voice that this would be a thing in a file with a stapled solution. "Not on private ground," the officer said. "We've found a few on Bureau land the last couple years. Usually they're smaller, stashed with what you'd expect. Snares, salt blocks, sometimes bait. This one's crafted." The deputy looked up at Evan. "You touch anything?" He nodded and pointed to the root shelf where he'd tucked the metal and the can. She put on gloves, worked gently, and brought them out one by one. The can she bagged without a word. The box she turned in her hand, the way he had, weighing not just metal, but implication. "We'll open this at the office," she said. "If it's tied to what we think it is, it could be evidence. Thank you for calling." The box took a day to open because the lab wanted it clean. When the deputy called, her voice kept the smile out of the words, but not out of his ear. Ammunition. A few old tags, the numbers worn but legible to people who make it their business to pull ink from time. A map, and this was the bone under all the meat, with a handful of circles drawn in pencil, deep in the patchwork of timber and BLM ground, that fenced ordinary farmers out with green signs and warnings more polite than they needed to be. The circles weren't tight, they weren't sloppy. They were placed with the care of a person who would not say the word cash where anyone could hear it. Two of those circles, when the ODFW officer laid them over his own mapping software, lined neatly with places where an infrared camera had once caught the glint of a lure line or a trap that shouldn't have been. The others were new. Men drove up a forest road 2 counties east that night and didn't come back the way they expected to. Evan learned this because the deputy told him in person, standing under his eave with rain easing back into drizzle after pretending it was done all afternoon. She didn't say arrested like in the shows. She said, "We have several people in custody pending charges," and he could tell it mattered to her that the words be right. The story left his valley the way a fire sometimes does when wind finds it. The local paper ran a piece that put his last name wrong and said he'd cut open the tree, which made him feel like a man who had taken a crowbar to a grave. He didn't answer the reporter who left a message. He didn't answer the man from Portland who wanted to come film the ditch. He did answer an old woman who left a voicemail that said her late husband had talked about hollow trees on the line between the old timber company tract and the crown of their place in the 70s, how he'd called them ghost barrels, and how he'd kept a small picture of one in a drawer, as if that could keep such a thing from happening again. He called her because she spoke like a person who knew a ditch was a ditch, whether you were 19 or 90. She mailed him the picture. In it, a man with sideburns that bristled like fence wire stood next to a log with a dark smile split down its side. He could only see the inside as a shadow, but the curve of it matched the thing in his field, the way 2 rivers can match. Never every grain, but the shape. Work folded back in, as it will for a farmer, even when the world wants you to be a symbol. He cleared the head gate with the chainsaw he'd left on the flatbed that first morning, keeping his cut shallow and careful so he wouldn't snag metal in the chain, and kept checking for that barrel-hollow sound before he set the bar. He fixed fence, tamping posts back into ground that behaved like a stubborn animal. He ran a line of gravel into the lane where the storm had eaten it soft, spread it with an old landscape rake because the rig that made such work easy was not a rig he owned. When he walked with his eyes on the trunks, the way a man who's had his house broken into looks at windows for the next year. He found another hollow 3 weeks later, smaller, 2 bends down the creek on the neighbor's side, where the land tilts and becomes someone else's responsibility. He didn't open it, he took a picture, he texted the deputy. When ODFW came, the officer with the clean boots now had boots that looked how boots ought to look. He grinned at Evan without showing teeth and said, "We should hire you." Evan said without meaning to, "You couldn't afford me," and that made them both laugh in that quiet way men laugh when they mean the opposite of the quick kind. Spring moved like it had signed a truce with winter, but didn't trust the ink. The alfalfa came on, not shy, the way it does when it's pleased with its own work. The calves kicked and spoiled perfectly good coats on mornings that felt like mornings in other years. The valley shook off the story like a dog shakes water, except when it didn't. Now and then, a stranger's SUV would idle at the end of Evans Lane, and someone with a camera phone would stare through a windshield at a man who did not change what he was doing to be looked at. He set 2 trail cameras of his own, after the deputy had gotten the warrants for the ones the county hung. He placed them high because he had noticed that people who mean trouble think only of eyes that look straight ahead. On the footage, he found deer, a bobcat once in blue dawn light moving like a thought, so careful it didn't disturb the idea of stillness. and the backs of two men he didn't know crossing the neighbour's fence line by stepping on the lower strand like boys who'd never been caught. He sent the clip to the deputy and felt the rightness of it land in his chest, in the place where earlier there had been nothing but wrong. Mason asked him, 2 months into the slow aftermath, "Does the forest hate us now?" They'd been hauling square bales, and the kid had the red on his cheeks and the bend to his legs that said he'd earned his food. The question sat between them, the way sometimes a post you set leans a little, and you have to decide whether to reset it now or let it find its centre overnight. "No," Evan said, rolling his shoulders and feeling the simple gratitude of a body still willing to obey. The forest doesn't love or hate. It remembers. It grows where it can, and takes back what it can and keeps its own quiet until somebody louder than themselves tries to use it like a closet. All we can do is listen when it says something's wrong and fix what we can reach. The boy nodded like a boy nods when he isn't sure he understands yet, but trusts the man teaching him will keep saying it in different words until he does. Summer slipped in, bringing a kind of peace that wasn't silence but work. The deputy called less often because there was less to say. The men arrested on the forest road were waiting on their day in court. The box, he learned, would be evidence number 9 in a case that would weave in and out of counties he didn't drive to, attorneys' names he wouldn't remember, and law he had always assumed did what it should if people holding it chose not to look away. The ODFW officer, boots scuffed now like a ribbon dragged over gravel, stopped by once with a coffee in a paper cup and said, "We're looking at patterns. The hollows, the bait, the salt blocks, the way the circles on that map match places where somebody skinned something they shouldn't have and didn't bother to bury deep." He didn't say thank you again, because there are only so many times a man can stand to hear the same gratitude. Instead, he asked about his trail cam angle, and the officer told him to tilt it 5 degrees left and 10 degrees up, and to scrub the tree with a handful of fern afterward to confuse any nose that thought it had learned something about human hands. By fall, the trunk at the ditch had slumped into itself. Where there had been a single grand curve, there were now wedges and plates of bark like broken pottery. The ditch ran under it without complaint, because water is faithless to the shapes we prefer. Evan still tapped logs when he came to them, a reflex like checking a gate latch twice in the dark. He found a new sound he could not unhear, the difference between a hollow that was natural and a hollow that was made. The natural hollows sometimes gave back a fibrous shiver when you touched your knuckles to them, a tremor of rot and sponge, and the slow work of beetle and fungus. The crafted ones rang in a different register, as if a man, with no music, had tried to tune an instrument by eye. He thought sometimes, at the end of long days when the light went thin, and the line of trees on the ridge turned into a shadow that felt like a bruise under a shirt, about what had started all of it, a single wrong sound in a morning of wrong after a night of worse. He thought of how easy it would have been to tell himself, not now, later, you'll come back. He pictured a version of himself that had done that, a man who had lifted the headgate, slung the shovel, cursed the storm, and left the hollow to be what it had become, because somebody else had needed a place to tuck away their cruelty. That version of himself had a field maybe a little greener for an extra hour's water, and slept maybe a little better for a week. But in every version of that imagining, what gnawed didn't stop gnawing. The rope would still have been there, the box, the grooves, the maps that went from drawn circles to real footsteps. He didn't speak the word fate, because he was not a man who believed he made bargains with anything but weather and bills. But he allowed that sometimes a thing will ask you what kind of person you are, without putting the question into a shape you can ignore. Winter found them again, and the storm stories came with it, as they do when the first hard rain convinces the valley the sky still keeps the keys. He put fresh batteries in the cameras, wrapped the wellhead in fiberglass like a gift, stacked tarps by the barn door where he could reach them one-handed in a hurry. There were fewer hollows that year, or maybe fewer that had been made recently. Whether that was because the people who made them had been carried off into a system that would not be kind to them, or because the next group was slower to learn the old tricks, He didn't know. He knew only that the sound had taught him something, and that teaching had changed him into a kind of sentinel he had never put on his to-do list. The valley didn't celebrate him. It didn't mock him either. It did what valleys do. It kept growing where the water and the hands allowed. Sometimes the deputy would call and not say anything about a case at all, just ask how the calves were gaining, or whether the bailiff had decided to forgive him for last summer's cussing. Sometimes the ODFW officer would text him a picture of a bear caught on a camera he didn't say the location of, black fur turned blue by dawn light, and Evan would look at the angle of the animal's shoulder and think, alive, and then think, please let it stay that way. Mason grew into the length of his legs and began to speak about leaving and coming back in the same sentence, which is a language farm kids often learn. And Wyatt learned that cows feel the rain in the same way people do, if the same means that wet is wet, and trouble is trouble, and shelter is shelter, which is sometimes as much as a boy needs to know at 9, any way you count it. On a morning in March, when the fields were still instead of muddy, he walked past the place where the first hollow had been. What remained looked like a scar scabbed over, bark shards, a depression where the trunk had surrendered into mulch, a smudge of darker earth where the ditch had changed its mind and then changed it back. He put his palm to the ground without quite knowing why. It was cool and gave under his hand with that living elasticity that meant worms and fungus and the work that never makes a headline. A red tail called from the alder, and he tilted his head to listen, as if the hawk might choose to speak a word a man could use. The creek kept talking. It always would. He picked up the shovel because there was a day to have, and he was the man who had been given it to use. When people asked him later, in grocery aisles, or at the counter of the machine shop, where somebody always had a part and a story to go with it, why he'd done what he'd done, he found himself saying the same thing without practice. The land tells you when something's wrong. You just have to be the kind of person who stops to hear it. Sometimes the person asking would nod like they'd heard those words before somewhere else, and he supposed they had, out of the mouth of a logger, in a paper or on a screen, who'd said something that sounded enough like what he'd said, that the world had cut it out and glued it where it pleased. He didn't mind. There are only so many true sentences, and they get handed around. He went home, he closed gates, he opened them again, he listened. If this story finds you on a day when the wind has shoved the world into a new shape, and you're standing in a field or on a road, or at the edge of a patch of woods that looks like itself but isn't, when every shadow feels borrowed and even the sky seems to lean the wrong way, then pause for a moment. The land has ways of speaking, and sometimes it only waits for someone willing to stand still long enough to hear. If you catch a sound that doesn't belong, something bent, something that clings to the air like a burr on cloth, don't rush past it. Don't tell yourself it was only the branch, only the creek, only your imagination. These are the excuses that keep the world turned away from what it's asking. Set your hand down against whatever is near, a gatepost, the trunk of an old tree, the hood of a car still ticking with heat, and knock once, just once. Not to frighten, not to summon, but to show you are listening. Then hold still, because the land always answers. Sometimes it murmurs back in the hollow thump of roots far below. Sometimes it shifts in the wings of birds that break away all at once. Sometimes the answer is nothing at all, and even silence is a kind of reply. And if what you hear is not silence but a wrong that wears a patient face, that lingers with the confidence of something that knows most people will pass by, it's your part to notice. The land will not beg. It will not shout. It will wait with the stillness of a wound that has decided to keep itself until someone chooses to mend it. If you feel that weight, don't turn away. Call someone who carries the tools to set things straight, someone whose hands are taught in the old languages of repair, justice, or healing. After that, go back to your list. Because the list matters. The work matters. The ordinary weight of chores and promises is what steadies the ground beneath us. But hold this truth alongside it. While you were folding your day into tasks and lines to be crossed, the storm was already moving. The next storm is already taking a number the way storms do. patient, relentless, waiting its turn to come knocking. And if you want to hear more of these true, strange things the land sometimes says, keep coming back. Tell us where you're listening from. Tell us the names of the rivers near you, the ridges that cut your horizon, the alleys that whistle after midnight. Because the places are different, their shapes drawn by history and weather and time. But the sound, when it's wrong and asking for you to be the person who stops, is always the same.